Hey everyone, I hope you're all having a great day. With the coming release of yet another Call of Duty, I wanted to talk about a topic that has been controversial since the beginnings of Black Ops 2, and that is of course SBMM. You probably already know what SBMM is, but just in case you don't, SBMM stands for Skill-Based Matchmaking, and it is essentially a matchmaking philosophy in which skill is some part a factor in how players are matched together within a game. There are perhaps hundreds, if not thousands of videos made on the topic of SBMM already. And the opinion of it, at least in the most vocal parts of the COD community, is that it is generally a bad thing that makes the game unfun, because it punishes players for improving at the game and ruins the casual experience. It's also blamed for negatively affecting connection quality because by only matchmaking certain players together, it prevents the matchmaking from achieving optimal network performance. From an outside perspective, SBMM sounds like it should be a great idea since it gives everyone an equal opportunity to perform well. However, in a game like Call of Duty, where winning isn't particularly important and fun is inversely proportional to difficulty, SBMM is wildly unpopular. In this video, rather than simply ranting about SBMM, I want to take a more objective approach and talk about what it is exactly, why it's in the game in the first place, and what its hypothetical removal would mean for the game. Since SBMM is a catch-all term for any kind of matchmaking that involves skill, there are many implementations of SBMM that we could talk about. The first, most basic, and largely uncontroversial version of it is simply team balancing, where teams are formed in theory to give each team an equal chance of winning the game. The vast majority of players agree that this is a good system. Nobody wants to be in a one-sided game, and due to the nature of probability, the majority of games would be one-sided if it were not for a team balancer. We don't really need to talk about this too much, since even the most vocal SBMM opponents agree that team balance is a good thing. In fact, many opponents of SBMM suggest that randomized matchmaking along with a team balancer is the optimal way to set up games. Another form of SBMM is what I would call rating-based matchmaking, in which players are matched based on an MMR or an ELO system. Most gamers know this as a ranked system, in which matchmaking is essentially based on how good you are at winning games. In short, a ranked system works by taking points away from players that lose and giving them to players that win, and then matching players based on the value of their accumulated points. It's worth noting that many games that use a rating-based matchmaking in their ranked modes will layer a manipulated point system on top of the MMR so that the ranked experience can be manipulated in some artificial way. A good example is the LP system in League of Legends. While Call of Duty definitely has SBMM in casual modes, it's important to emphasize that it is fundamentally different from the rating system that they implement in the ranked playlist. I'm highlighting this because many players question why SBMM is present in unranked modes when there already is a ranked mode in place. If you understand that the SBMM in both modes are fundamentally different, then it is easy to realize that the presence of SBMM in casual modes must be trying to achieve something different. Enter what I call performance-based matchmaking. In recent years, this has been dubbed Engagement Optimized Matchmaking, or EOMM, which is a name based on motivation rather than implementation, but it's essentially what I'm talking about. The SBMM in Call of Duty doesn't care too much about your wins, which makes it distinctly different from a typical ranked system. Many players suggest that the performance tracker is based on kill-death ratio, but I don't think that this is the case, or at least it's not the entire story. Although kill-death ratio may be more equalized across the player population, I think it's reasonable to suggest that the system in place must be based on more than just kill-death ratio, since it is possible for players to hold kill-death ratios higher or lower than 1 for extended periods of time. Nobody outside of the developers really know how the system is implemented, and those who do know are likely bound by non-disclosure agreements because whatever system they've designed is worthy of being patented, and is of course considered proprietary software. My hypothesis, based on what I've experienced, is that the system likely tracks multiple basic player stats that you might not even expect, such as how well you move, how quickly you react, and how accurate you are. What I'm saying is that the SBMM in Call of Duty matches players based specifically on mechanical skill rather than simply overall skill. So if you're a slide-canceling, bunny-hopping, quick-reacting tryhard, you'll be categorized as a mechanically skilled player. And if you're a crouch-walking, window-camping, ADS-holding bot, you'll be categorized as a not mechanically skilled player. As such, the 5-year-old kid and the 50-year-old dad who play very slowly are never paired with the so-called movement gods. Keep in mind that mechanical skill is only one part of your overall skill as a player, and so being able to shoot accurately and react quickly doesn't guarantee that you'll have a good KD. And so you might still be completely destroyed by more well-rounded players. Some players may question why they get trashed in their games when there's supposed to be skill-based matchmaking to protect them, and the reason might be that you're mechanically skilled but strategically weak. I'm probably wrong in the details, but I think it's fairly certain that the game has some way to measure your performance, especially your recent performance. Call of Duty used to use lifetime stats to categorize your skill level, but it led to people essentially creating Ultra Smurf accounts, which allowed them to dominate lobbies game after game. And so, a few years ago, the system was changed to emphasize your recent performance, so now you need to throw several games before you're placed into a lower skilled lobby. Although performance is a rather abstract word, it is concrete enough for us to talk about why such a system is in place at all and why it is so strongly implemented in Call of Duty. If the community has been so vocal about SBMM for more than a decade, why is it that Activision refuses to listen? Is it because they're stupid, or is it because they know something that we don't? One might assume that the purpose of SBMM is to promote competitive gameplay, make the game fair, or to protect the bad players from the good players, and these are all somewhat correct, but miss the point. The answer to why SBMM exists is far simpler, and that is that SBMM is an application of what I call profit-driven game design theory. That's my fancy way of saying that SBMM is primarily a monetization strategy and not a strategy for maintaining competitive integrity. I might as well end the video here, but SBMM goes much deeper than you might think. It's not just something that Activision threw together 10 years ago in an attempt to protect certain players. The reason they hold confidence in SBMM is because they have reason to. Activision has very likely invested real money in some serious research and development on the effects of SBMM. And it may as well be a formal field of study combining multiple academic disciplines across statistics, psychology, and computer science to create a system that manipulates players into spending money. There are people who host actual conferences specifically talking about game monetization and how to best psychologically manipulate your player base.
Some of you will probably be slightly shocked by all the tricks I have listed here. I'll leave the morality of it out of the talk. The very best way to get these guys to spend is to get two rich competitive guys to fight each other and tell them, I'll give you a slight upside if you pay me. The achievers want to progress in the game. The socializers want to speak to other people. The killers just want to compete and kill each other. And the explorers are the guys who are after stories and experiences. You sell convenience to the achievers, customization to socializers, competitive advantage, that is pay to win for the killers, and content for explorers. The reason I highlighted convenience up there, most of your sales will be here. If it's too clearly pay to win, people will stop playing. Selling content is very expensive. Hardly any team can keep up. This one I like a bit better. Hook, habit, hobby. The hook is what gets you into the game. Then you build it into a habit that you play multiple sessions every day. At the end, it's the hobby phase. This is also where you get basically unlimited upper spend. There are 4 ways of progressing in games in general. You can have a skill-based game. You can have a luck-based game. You can have a game where you just progress by grinding, or you can pay. Make sure that your games aren't too skill-based. A too skill-based game, you don't get people to pay you because there's no reason to.
A key point made in this video is that games should not be too skill-based. It may sound confusing since we're talking about a system called skill-based matchmaking, which begs the question, how is that not skill-based? What matters isn't implementation but presentation. What matters isn't how hard the game is, but that the outcomes the player is presented with are satisfactory regardless of whether or not they are actually good at the game. With this in mind, SBMM is the perfect system because it guarantees that no matter if you're a good player or a bad player, your perception of the game is consistent. Many players on YouTube claim to be casual players who want a casual experience, but I would describe your average YouTube gaming viewer to be more of an enthusiast than a casual. The enthusiast sits somewhere between a casual player and a competitive player. A competitive player plays games to prove they're good, and they play ranked modes so that they can show off their skills. And this kind of player has largely been ignored until recently, probably because competitive FPS players aren't interested in games like Call of Duty. An enthusiast is not particularly competitive, so they do care about the performance to some extent, but they don't need to show off. In contrast, Activision has their eyes set on attracting the truly casual player, the kind of gamer that plays games solely to press buttons, and the kind of player that is not concerned with becoming great at the game, and simply wants something to give them a sense of satisfaction in their free time. Basically, the kind of player that plays your average mobile game. The game needs to be rewarding but not too challenging so that it doesn't scare off the average player. The behavior of the enthusiast and casual markets differ in that enthusiasts are not likely to stop playing due to a bad experience, whereas casual players are very likely to leave if presented with too much of a challenge. The enthusiast market, although they say they aren't satisfied, continue to spend money year after year anyway, regardless of how strong SBMM is. And so there is very little motivation to change anything about the system. Sure, some players eventually do get tired of SBMM and leave altogether, but the loss to revenue just doesn't compare to what could be gained by appealing to the casuals. There are just too many players who are more than content spending money on skins while going 10-8 every game. There is just too much money to be made from players who don't care about their skill for Activision to simply give them up. Beyond just financial motivation, we can also consider what SBMM means for the game as a whole, and what its hypothetical removal would entail. Whether SBMM is good or not depends greatly on what kind of player you are. If you're the kind of player who gets enjoyment from pub stomping and maintaining stats, then of course SBMM is terrible. If all you want to do is relax and shoot at stuff and occasionally get some kills, then SBMM is great because it makes it much easier to accomplish that stress-free. Where there is tension is what if you're a good player who also wants to relax and be stress-free? Well, in that case, you're out of luck. Activision knows that a single decent player can ruin the perceived experience of 6 players on the enemy team at the same time. Activision, of course, sides with the 6 casual players and wants to protect them. Perhaps one thinks that they deserve and have earned the right to slaughter those 6 players since they put in the time and effort to get good at the game and those 6 players haven't. But unfortunately, that kind of mentality is simply antithetical to the longevity of games and the player base. The truth is, perhaps the sad truth, is that when players face challenges, they're more likely to stop playing altogether than they are to step up to the challenge. And so games that become too challenging tend towards smaller and smaller player counts over time. The best players become better and better, which means the game gets harder and harder, and so players just start packing up and leaving, until all you have left are the most hardcore players. A good example is Fortnite. Once the average player became too skilled at building, and so the game became unapproachable to the casual player, they implemented SBMM and no-build modes that were less difficult to play. Another example is Quake, known for being one of the hardest FPS games of all time, and therefore is widely unpopular. And so the justification for SBMM is, since the good players will eventually be the only players that play the game anyway, why not just have SBMM now so at least the bad players won't leave? One solution I've heard proposed is that there should be 2 separate playlists in which one has SBMM and the other doesn't. The reason this isn't implemented is because the #1 rule of psychological manipulation is making sure that the person you're manipulating doesn't know you're doing it. By creating a separate playlist, it serves only to tell the average player that they aren't as good as they think they are. And that's definitely not something you want to do if you want them to spend money on the game. In conclusion, I don't think SBMM is going to be going anywhere anytime soon. I want to clarify that I'm not an SBMM supporter, I just want to explain why it exists and why you should give up any hopes that it will ever be removed from Call of Duty. I personally am mostly indifferent to the existence of SBMM since I enjoy tryharding in ranked modes anyway. One game that I'm excited to see release is of course X-Defiant, which has promised to be a casual shooter without an SBMM system. While I am hopeful that X-Defiant becomes a huge success, I fear that the game will suffer the same fate as Quake, where after a certain amount of time, the only players left playing are the most hardcore competitive players. That's all I have to say for now. If you made it this far, I want to thank you for watching and consider subscribing and leaving a like and comment to support the channel. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful day.